Well, thank you very much. I've been asked to talk a bit about how we should work with government, and I think the first thing to say is that it's not easy. Government doesn't find it easy to work with itself, leave alone with people outside, and there is a real issue about the fact that government isn't, even if it's the best of governments, it isn't properly joined up. And our problem is that we're dealing with all sorts of bits of government, and we tend to forget that, because different parts of government deal with the things which for us are integral to the whole matter of packaging. And in the work that Sancroft has been doing, the company which I chair have been doing on plastics right across the board, what we've discovered very clearly is that the fundamental problem we face is that we don't have the kind of integrated answer. And therefore people go rushing after what seems to be an easy solution. They think there is a silver bullet, when of course it isn't like that, because plastic and packaging as a whole are there for a reason. It's been an essential part of the overall change that we have in the lifestyle of people, not only in Britain, but in the developed world as a whole. Without packaging, we wouldn't have the sort of society that we do have. And for many reasons, we can argue a very good case for packaging. When people talk about it as if it is somehow unnecessary and without value, it's that they've forgotten that they can now have much fresher food much longer, that they can support families where both parents are out of work, where they can put things easily into a freezer, that they can find and use things when they want it, that they can make choices which they couldn't once make. I'm old enough to remember my mother going to the village shops with a basket, of course, because there was no question of a plastic bag, with a basket, and going down to buy what was there. Not what she wanted, but what was there. To buy vegetables which had gone up from the market gardens locally to Covent Garden, which was where it used to be, had turned around and come back again, and was there in the village greengrocer pretty tired. Indeed, we grew a lot of our own vegetables, not because my father had either the time or the inclination, but simply because it was so much better than the awful vegetables that you got in most towns and cities. And then you went into the butcher and the same thing was true. And then into the grocers and found that the choice was very limited. And I think before we talk about packaging, we should begin to recognise right from the beginning that people didn't take to packaging because they had some sort of odd, peculiar desire for it. They took up to packaging because it did things, it created things, it made it possible for things. It was essential for the kind of lives we live. And unless we're prepared to start there, we can have no proper conversation with government because we don't know what it is that we're talking about. We're not just trying to meet particular views. What we're trying to say is, here is something which matters to the economy of this country. How do we make sure that it doesn't destroy the environment of this country and others? But let's start by saying that it matters. And so then when we are dealing with government, we've also got to understand what it is that their problem is. You know, in business, we all understand in business, if you want to sell a product, you've got to start off by wanting to find out what your customer wants. What's his particular problem? Not trying to say, I've got this thing, so I'm going to make you want it. That's not a good way to sell things. It's, how do I show him that the product that I've got is exactly what he needs? And we always know that the best salesmen are able to make you feel that it's exactly what you need, even though it's the opposite of what you've come in to buy. Well, now, what is it that government needs? Well, first of all, it needs to be able to show the world that it is taking proper action. And in an odd and dangerous way, It's more important to show that you're taking the action than to show that the action's worked. And that's one of the problems. And Sancroft has been trying to discuss these issues. It's been terribly important to get people to say, don't just say what the action is, but really work through what happens if you do that. And work through, too, how much it's going to cost. So the first thing that government has to know is that what you are proposing enables it to show that they are taking real action. The second thing is that the government is constantly, any government, doesn't matter what politics it is, any government is constantly concerned as to what are the front page stories of the Daily Mail. So it's not just taking action, but taking action of a kind which the Daily Mail will see as being appropriate and acceptable and not upsetting some part of its audience. So the two things are essential, that we understand that that is what the government needs to do. And we understand that even if it wasn't this government, whatever government was there would need to do those things. And the third thing I think we have to understand with dealing with government is that the particular issue with which we are specially concerned, which is plastics, ain't going to go away. There have been times in which packaging has been unpopular. There have been times when people have sought to have less packaging. But there's never been a time in which we have seen so clearly that a particular kind of packaging is really something which the public is becoming not just worried about, but increasingly worried about, and every sign is that that will go on. There is no way out of it. And I must say, in the work that we've done with the food packaging organisation, I have to say, the last speaker, I admire enormously, because what that organisation did was to see that you had to do something about it long before the Daily Mail decided that you had to do something about it. I'm always fascinated by newspapers who say, our campaign has achieved this. Well, you know perfectly well that you've been doing it years before the campaign has actually been set up. But if you're sensible, you have to be there before. And that's what Sancroft's tried to try all the time, is to be there before it. And so how do you really deal with government then? You have to make them understand that you're not trying to do something to get off or to get away with something that you need to. You have to make them understand that you are honest about it. And I do think the industry is honest about the fact, first of all, that we need packaging. Secondly, that at the present time we certainly need plastic packaging. And thirdly, that we need to find ways of making it less damaging and increasingly better for the environment. That we believe all those three things, and that the government ought to believe all those three things too. So how then do we really then make sure the government makes the right decisions? Because the trouble is, it's very easy to make knee-jerk decisions. It's very easy to catch the headlines, and very easy, therefore, to decide to do things which don't work. Now, it might be a very good idea to have a test of deposit return scheme. But before you have tests about it, you ought to really realise what the problems are. I'm not trying to suggest that we should not accept that it would be a good idea to test things, but let us remember, for example, that no country which has the kind of widespread curbside collection that we have has ever introduced a deposit return scheme. That has never done. So one of the things we have to tell the government is you do realise you're doing something entirely new. So that's always a bit worrying for government. It may not be the best route. And secondly, you have to say to people, you do realise what it's going to cost. That's a very important issue, because the fact is they are going to be nailed by it. If they want to do this, or whatever it is, then the cost is very important. And thirdly, you have to say, you do realise that it isn't actually going to address the real problem. And that's also very important. Now, that doesn't mean to say you don't want to test it, doesn't mean to say that you want to take for granted what people say. But it does mean to say that you should try to help the government not to make promises which it feels it then has to carry through, even though it's learnt that the proposal wasn't exactly what they wanted to do. So it's very important to be truthful and open with government, and even if it sounds unpopular at the time, it actually in the end earns the respect of ministers. The second thing you have to do, having been so clear, you then have to show how best to do what the government needs to do in a way which works for the industry. Because in the end, it has to work for the industry, because the government needs it to work for the industry, because the government's not going to do it, the government can't do it, we have to do it. So we have to be honest about a number of issues. Let me take a very simple example. We were talking only yesterday with a company which was discussing how we could more effectively recycle black plastic trays. Now, the truth is, it won't get any headlines, but if you could make them black without using carbon, it's much easier to recycle them. That's an issue which the industry can understand. It also is more expensive, so we have to work out how that works. And we have to help the government to think about that. Because if the government wants something to be done on the fact of black plastic trays, there's not much point of doing it without having faced up to the issues that you need to have if you're going to do it. And this is true right across the board. An awful lot of small things. Just think how long it's taken us to get the government to understand how balmy it is that every district council has a different list of things to recycle. I mean, I remember listening to Mr. Pickles, the large gentleman, you remember. I'd produced a plan, actually, called The Quality of Life, and in it was a plan to have a standardised system for all this. And Mr. Pickles said, oh no, we can't have that. That means taking away the power of local authorities to make their own choices. What a balmy concept. The fact of the matter is, if you really think that local government depends on being able to choose the sort of plastic you recycle and the sort that you don't, in order to show that Suffolk Coastal is different from mid-Suffolk, seems to me it's pretty potty. And as a result, they all collect different things. So I live in mid-Suffolk, and I have a sister-in-law who lives in Suffolk Coastal. She's not very well. So I go and do a bit of help. And when I have to throw things away, what do? Well, I'm a geek. So I look through the list and I find out what I have to put in. I'm the only person in the entire district who bothers to look at the list. So as a result, most people put it in to the non-recyclable because that's easier and simpler. We just have to help government to see that the best may well be the enemy of the good, but if you want the good, you want to make it simple. You want to make it simple and you want to make it clear. So we want to be able to mark anything that's recyclable, recyclable, and anything that isn't recyclable, not recyclable. That isn't difficult. Government must understand that. And we've got to get close enough to the government to show how we can help them. But there is a quid pro quo too. Government has also got to say that every local council must have a basic minimum standard of recycling so that everybody knows it. Felix, who looks after Sancroft's work on plastic, Felix once said to me, isn't it odd, we've got a system in which we put the biggest the biggest problems of recycling on the people least likely to deal with it and least likely to care about it, the customer. So we just make it more difficult for them than anybody else in the system. And what we ought to be doing is exactly the opposite. And that is indeed what we have to help the government to do. We have to show the government that we are literally there to help you. because we want it to succeed. And that's the bit I want to leave some time for questions, but that's the bit I want to come closest to. The biggest danger for this industry and for the government is that it introduces a programme which doesn't work. Because two things happen. If it doesn't work, then governments always move on to more of the same, because that seems to be automatic. So if you tax it and it doesn't work, you double the tax. If you have rules which don't work, you double the rules. So it's very dangerous for that reason. But the second reason is we actually want it to work, because unless we make it work, then this public reaction, which is so fundamental and so long-lasting, that public reaction will only increase and get worse. And I don't want a world in which people feel that there's nothing they can do about it. There's nothing that they can do because it always goes wrong. The cynicism which that creates is extremely bad. So we need to think of that, even if we don't think about the fundamental reason why we want it to work, is that it has to work because of the effect on the environment if it doesn't work. So let's make sure that we help the government to make it work. And let's make sure, therefore, that we are prepared to say what should work. And I'll just remind you, we are in a very fortunate position, and the government ought to recognise what a fortunate position it is. We have got the whole government together, the whole industry together, with a very basic plan. Now, you've got one of the authors of the plan here, but we've managed to get everybody together. I chaired the meeting. I saw all these people who are normally arguing with each other as to what we should do, coming round to 6 very simple principles. And if the government takes those 6 principles, we'll have a system which really does work. It starts, of course, with saying that you've got to collect the same stuff, and you've got to make that really work. That's the right thing to do. So, secondly, it says that everybody's got to join in. It isn't any good allowing large numbers of people to exclude themselves because they claim to be below a de minimis level. And the third thing is you've actually got to get some money to be able to advertise to consumers as to what they need to do, and to help local authorities to get more collections for on the go, because that's our big problem. People who are taking plastic packaging on the way and there's nowhere to put it. And there's nothing so bad as having nowhere to put it, except having somewhere to put it which is so full you can't put it. That's much the worst thing of all. Now, those last 2 things I'm very keen on, because that's what I wanted in the first place. When I invented the PRN system, I have to tell you, I wanted to have a fund to help local authorities and a fund to help people understand what we were doing. And I wanted everybody to join in, because it seemed to me it had to be everybody. And I'm afraid my colleagues in the government at the time refused to allow me to have those 2 things. So I want you to help me to have my own back. I am determined that we should do those 2 things, which really matter and are very, very important towards the ending of these mistakes. And then we've got to have a PRN system which actually rewards good people and charges less good people. So if you have recycled packaging in your packaging, you should get credit for it. You shouldn't pay so much towards the PRNs. If you have recyclable packaging, you should pay less for the people who don't have recycled packaging, so that we actually pay properly and we encourage the good and make the bad more expensive. I don't believe in trying to enforce morality upon people. The Church, with the help of the Almighty, has found that quite difficult over the years, and we are in not so strong a position. And so it seems to me that what you have to do is to make it easy to be good and difficult to be bad. That's how you do it, and that's what we should do in this arrangement. And if you put those together and add to it a very important thing, which is to make it less valuable to export. Seems to me an outrage that the PERNs are actually more valuable in a sense than PRNs because you get them with very much less proof. And that's why I think it's right to say that you'd have to prove that every bit of an export product was actually packaging, was actually going to be recycled. And if you didn't do that, then you'd only get 70% or 80% of the package allowed, the bale allowed, because we all know that in many of those bales in the centre are things which never saw a product in their lives and had nothing to do with packaging at all. And so if you do those 6 things, you can make a huge difference. And we need together to help the government to see that this would deliver the goods. And we need to be willing to listen to any other ideas to add to it. But we should make sure the government recognises what an enormous advantage it has over any previous government. It's actually got an offer from the whole industry which has been brought together with blood, sweat and tears. And 1 or 2 of those people who've been doing it are here, know very well that the government could take all that and get real support. And there's nothing like real support to make something work. Do that and we can work with government really effectively. And I just hope everybody here will add their voices to those 6 points and make it clear that we're not going to be divided. We are determined to deliver that, and we're not going to go back on our word, and we want the government to make it possible for us to do our best to give this industry the kind of image it ought to have in a world where we have sustained a huge knock, but we were fortunate enough to have got ourselves prepared much more effectively than the industry has been prepared before. And so thank you all very much. And now, if anyone's got a question, I'm very happy to try to answer it.
There is a microphone. Where is the...
There is a microphone, and there are 2 questions over there. Do we?
Well, announce who you are. And
if there's no microphone, then shout. Let the gentleman start.
Thank you. Very good speech. I have a question which is slightly off piece to the packaging discussion that we're having, which is on the subject of energy from waste. My question would be, I know that in Scandinavian countries, very little of the rubbish that's collected goes to landfill. I believe it's only about 3%, with the balance being used to generate heat and electricity for housing in Denmark, Sweden, Finland. Why isn't the government doing more to make sure that the residual packaging stream, once we've done all the good things that we can do as an industry, isn't put to much better use and used to make electricity instead of ending up in the oceans or on our beaches?
Well, I think I have to divide those 2 bits of that, because the fact of the matter is that the material that would be so used is unlikely actually to be ending up on the oceans, the beaches, because you've already collected it. You're making the choice about what you then do with it. Now, there is a real argument between Friends of the Earth Denmark and Friends of the Earth Britain, so you can see the division. Friends of the Earth Denmark are very keen on energy from waste. Friends of the Earth in Britain are very much opposed to it. And the reason is that in Britain we were very slow to do recycling, and we're only now up to the average of the European Union. And our problem is that there is a real worry that if you overdo the energy to waste answer, that you won't do the other things. And that is a real issue. I think the answer is a rather different one, and I think the government must be encouraged to do this. As you heard, I brought in the landfill tax. My own view is that we should be toughening the landfill tax, and we should be banning more things from landfill, and that would force people to find alternatives. I don't want to do much more for energy for waste that we do at the moment. I think that the real thing is that there's a great deal more stuff that could be collected, which does get into the oceans. In other words, the collection area is a much more important area. And the other thing is that there's a good deal of the stuff that we do collect that we are not recycling effectively. That's why I'm very keen on the concept that we will be able to recycle black plastic trays. If we can do that, then that will be another whole area of stuff that we can do. I'd much prefer to go down that route, because I think that Friends of the Earth is right about Denmark, where they've always collected stuff, where they are good at doing that. They instinctively don't throw things about. And Friends of the Earth Britain is right about Britain, because I'm afraid we're very dirty. We have got into the habit of throwing away, and there is no such place as away. Lady there.
This will have to be our last question, I'm afraid.
Jane Beavis from the On-Pack Recycling label. Great speech, and I absolutely endorse everything there. Obviously, we're very concerned about engaging consumers, and I completely recognise the statement you made. We often say consumers are the weakest link in the circular economy chain. You know, we have corporate ownership of those materials all the way through, then we give them to 60 million people and hope we get some of it back. Do you think that, as well as making collection systems more consistent, labelling on-pack should be mandatory? And whilst it's not, do you think that there is brand value for those brands who do engage their consumers in that way?
Yeah, well, let me go to the last bit first. I mean, I think there is increasing brand value in being seen to be seriously involved in trying to solve this problem. I mean, I think, for example, Coca-Cola has done itself an enormous amount of good simply by showing that it's trying to find ways out of the problem. And that's a really important element in what you have to do. It's to show that you're actually concerned about it. Second thing is, I think it's insulting to the public not to make it easy for them. I do not understand why we have not done this. It was rather like I tried to get the government to do a very simple thing, which was to make people distinguish between aluminium and iron steel cans. Because why should you go around with a magnet in order to discover which is which? Seemed to me it should just have a simple thing. Well, they do now, but they wouldn't do it. This is all regulation, not another piece of regulation. It's a terribly simple concept. It is called information for the public. You must not expect the public to do the right thing if it's expected to learn how to do the right thing. Because only the most stupid and boring people think that knowing which can to put in which box is important. Most people have much more to their life, love, to start with, but a whole range of other things, much more to their life than the fact that we've all got to realise in this room that we're all peculiar, because we're all really interested in packaging. But you go outside this room and stop anybody else, they're not at all interested in packaging. So why should we assume they should be interested in packaging? What we've got to do is to make them. And this is one of the things Sancroft is always saying, make it easy. Just say to them, this is recyclable. But not, this is usually recyclable, or in many areas you will find this is recyclable, or unless you live in really one of the dottiest counties in the area, it's recyclable. You can't do that to people. They must have a very simple thing. It says recycle, so it goes into the right thing. And that means that we would have a total change, because once it's easy, then people begin to be ashamed of people who don't do it. And that's the last thing I want to say. We want to make it easy in order that people should become in Britain like many of our continental neighbours are, which is proud not to be dirty. We talk about the Scandinavians. I mean, one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about Brexit is that we've always been telling the rest of Europe that we should teach them things, and we've never been prepared to learn anything from our neighbours. And the fact is we have a lot to learn from other people, and we have a lot to teach them. I'm not suggesting at all that we don't have some wonderful things to teach them. I mean, we could teach the Portuguese to turn up on time, for example. There are a lot of things that we can do. But in the end, we can learn things from all of them. And one of the things we can learn is that you actually have in Scandinavia and in Holland and in a number of other European countries, you actually are frowned on in a really strong social way if you leave litter around. And people will pick up litter that people drop and hand it back to them with a pretty good ticking off. There's some, if I may dare say, there's some frightening ladies I've met who are extremely good at doing that in Britain. But we don't do it enough, and we really do not insist. And if we could change that, then the on-the-go problem would become much, much less. So let's not fail to do that as well. So you're right. Of course we should, and of course businesses would do very much better for themselves to do it before they need to. Let me finish by just, I know we've got a chap from Coca-Cola here, so I shall tell him a Coca-Cola story. I remember many years ago, we worked for Coca-Cola for many years, and Sancroft was doing this, and in those days you only had to put the calories on the non-calorie can. You only had, if you claimed that it was a slimming drink or it was less, you had to put the calories on. But if you didn't have to put the calories on. And we argued with Coca-Cola that they would find that if they put the calories on voluntarily before it was forced, it would do an awful lot of good. And you know it did. Two things happened. One was that people felt that they were being honest with them, and the other thing is that they found there were very many fewer calories than they thought there were. It had an extremely good effect in that sense. And very often, if people are secretive about things, or appear to be, then people think the worst. Now, I think that's true about recycling and non-recycling. I think if you don't tell them that it's recyclable, then people will think the worst and think that it isn't recyclable. So for goodness sake, go out there and say it, get the benefit from it, and do it now before it's forced, because they will force you. Of course they will. So get on with it, do it, and take the credit before somebody takes the credit away from you.